these were some of the things that young people would say to, the medical staff weren't ready for them, the waiting rooms didn't look that way, and I didn't know what that meant until one day I went to a clinic in Orange County, and I was thrown back by the amount of pink that was in the room. And I'm not averse to pink, but man, was it a place for women. And then you kind of wonder how young people sometimes find their space. The people that do it well and get it, do it very, very well. And the young men, and I think this is very important in a place like Iowa, that when you live in a rural area, there may be people in that clinic that know your family. And we thought it was just rural. But in urban centers, the communities are very insular, and the same thing was true. Like, I can't go to that clinic. My tia, works over there. My aunt works over there. And so, these are the things that young people constantly would mention to us about the clinical services. And sometimes, I remember the Boys and Girls Club, they would say, we don't refer to clinical services because girls don't need it or boys don't need it. And it was almost by the creator just doing something really profound. Here's the executive director of the Boys and Girls Club telling me that clinical services are not needed, and a young woman excuses herself to walk between us in the hallway, and she's about 7 months pregnant. and as she did, I let her go by, and I looked at her, and then he looked at her, and I said, so the kids that come to your center don't need clinical services. Is that what you're telling me? And it caused the paradigm shift for him. All our young people do. All our young people do. Because at some point, it's a natural part of their development. Communities that are unable to make the necessary investments in social and organizational infrastructures are often economically poor, but ethnically rich. And we have to recognize those outsets. And that community-led prevention and engagement ensures a greater likelihood of culturally competent staff, language-appropriate services, and interventions. I have a video I didn't share today. There's a man in Long Beach named Sanchez-Flores, and he's in the positive sense, a gatekeeper of services for men. Danny is a health educator, but he's also a former gang member. And Danny does things in his community that I can't do. And, he's a man that is raising a family now in a very positive way. And in that positive sense, I would want my son to have all those positive things that Danny had. I definitely don't want him to do the negative things that Danny did prior to that. But, that is in making the investment at the community level for the good. And then health education and prevention efforts are placed in the context of culture that it enhances it. So when you have young men that are trying to be responsible and they have the false teaching, reorienting them and then telling them why they need to behave in a positive way is really, really rooting for them. And the mothers and fathers in the community were always very supportive of this. We never had an issue of like mothers saying, we don't want our boys. We oftentimes would hear, we don't want it for the girls. But that's our double standard, okay? That's our double standard. And so young men would oftentimes be given a pass on this concept of information that we would want to withhold from girls. We had to emphasize what it was to be a positive man, and they had to learn who they were, not just as an individual, but as a member of their family and their community and society. That interconnectedness was really important. We had relevant guest speakers. We had ceremonies whenever they graduated from, mastering certain information, and we'd have retreats for them to go. And then the staff supported networks so participants can support one another in meetings and goals. So when we would go to meetings like we had today, about 1/3 to 40% of them were men. Very different place than we experience today. The first meetings we had looked like this, but it quickly shifted. And oftentimes we couldn't get training from trainers. We were doing the training within programs. That was the other reality. We had rites of passage programs. We had cultural reorientation and projects that expose young men to the rich spiritual traditions of their culture and their families. And oftentimes that is where the families became most appreciated. The mothers and fathers did have a spiritual tradition, but the kids were living outside of that because, you know what, they were hip young people. We had rites of passage programs because we realized that some young men needed to know when they had crossed the bridge to say, now you're expected to behave this way. Once you get information, you have to put that information into action. It's not good enough to know. And last night, I was sharing that we also worked with older men, the fathers of children. And we had círculos that would engage the older men about being positive reflections of the community and men. And you know, people always said, well, why is that? Why do you have círculos that do this? Why do you have men support groups? And I said, because otherwise there is nothing positive. The only time men would get together is when they had a beer between their legs, or in some cases, marijuana between their fingers. And so we were doing all this other stuff, and people didn't understand why that was so important until we were then doing discussions with the mothers who said, that is very, very important. That if we're going to teach our young men to be responsible, find the men in the community that are doing that, so that we can say, this is where you go. Because if there's no place to go, you're left in that ambivalent place where, okay, now what? I'm not like that. Who am I going to hang out with? And that was very, very important. And I'm very proud that there are círculos throughout the country now. And it is where I would want my son to reside. You know, that is where I would want him to reside when he needs to make a decision that is critical in his life. That in that circle, there are people that help him identify what his future would look like given what they know about his positive purpose. And that's what, you know, young people and men in general don't have. I'm always, you know, people always say, well, we have men's group in church. I said, great. That's exactly, but not everybody finds those groups there. You know, sometimes people find them in recovery groups in AA. You know, great. But for men that don't have recovery issues or addiction issues, aren't abusing their spouse or their partner, or aren't connected to a spiritual tradition, you need to have something distinct and different. And it's very, very important.